Okay, so we're 1 minute past the hour and we have a fair few people who've already joined us. So I think we will kick off. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Julian Fennick and I'm the CEO of GRC Solutions. And with me today is Vito Judice, a principal consultant with us. And today's topic is CPS 230 and looking at the post-implementation insights. We've had a lot of work in this area over the last 9 months, and even leading up to the due date around July last year. So we thought it was opportune to take this moment to have a look at how things are going, where are people in their journey, what the issues are that people have been facing, and so on. Before I start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking today, which the traditional custodians for us are the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Vito is joining us from Melbourne, from the lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating with us today. CPS 230 represents a significant uplift in how APRA-regulated entities manage operational risk and business continuity. We're also looking at those areas around service provider risk, and we'll discuss some of those areas about how do we maintain that service provider risk and look at those larger suppliers and how those things are a little bit different to some of the day-to-day things. Implementation has been a major focus for organisations. Today, we'll explore how to sustain and evidence that effectiveness of your program. The areas we're going to look at today are business continuity, material service providers, control testing and assurance, and other observations around CPS 230 that might support you in your journey. So we hope that that'll be the case. We will have some questions coming through, so feel free to pop those into the chat. I will try and get to them. If not, we will leave a few to the end and catch up with you there. And after the presentation, we will send you out some information about GRC Solutions consulting services and so on. I'm joined by Vito Judice today, who brings with us deep experience supporting financial services organisations through their CPS 230 uplift journey and their ongoing compliance. Vito has provided CPS 230 support to a range of APRA-regulated entities, including small banks, general insurers, private health insurers, and so on. Vito is an experienced governance, risk and compliance regulatory consultant and has held several positions, including Chief Risk Officer for various financial institutions and other services sectors. He was previously an executive director with one of the major global accounting and advisory firms. Vito is also the founder of Ascentium Consulting, where he provides risk and regulatory compliance advice to various organisations in the financial services sector. So please welcome Vito.
Thanks, Julian, and really excited to be here today to discuss post-implementation insights from CPS 230. And as Julian mentioned, I've worked extensively with a range of APRA-regulated entities over the last 18 months on CPS 230. And really what we're seeing at the moment is a shift from implementation to demonstrable effectiveness of an operational risk management framework. So there's been a lot of variation in what that looks like. So hopefully today we can share some of those insights with our audience.
Thanks, Vito. Let's start with business continuity then. What should organisations be focusing on now post-implementation?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Look, under CPS 230, the focus is really on ensuring that critical operations for a regulated entity can continue within the defined tolerances that you would have established as part of establishing your business continuity. So in terms of post-implementation priorities, they should cover 3 areas, and I'll go through each one carefully, but really at a higher level. The first point is around maintaining credible tolerances. Secondly, you should be looking at how you perform severe but plausible scenario testing scenarios. And then third, ensuring that you've got that clear mapping to critical operations and dependencies as well. So what I'll do now is I'll just go into each of those points in a little bit more detail. So as I said, the first area was around maintaining credible tolerances. So in a post-implementation environment for CPS 230, this might include the regular review and recalibration of your tolerance levels. Specifically, tolerances shouldn't always remain static because of, I'll just get to the right slide. They shouldn't always remain static because of the environment that you operate within. You should have a system in place now for reassessing your tolerance levels periodically. For example, you might do that on an annual basis to ensure that they reflect any changes in customer expectations, any regulatory developments, and any business growth or transformation, such as digitization of your processes and systems as well. It's also important that there's evidence-based validation of your tolerance levels. So what I mean by that is that tolerances should be supported by historical incident data, near-miss analysis, stress testing outcomes, and also industry benchmarks where they're available as well. And this is where the senior management team within the APRA-regulated entity also have a really important role to play as well. They should be challenging their teams about whether tolerance levels are whether they're sufficiently conservative or they might be too aggressive, to really fully understand the consequences of any breach scenarios as well. In terms of just a little tip for you to consider, don't set your tolerances, for the tolerances that you do set, make sure that they're not too theoretical, because that way they're hard to measure and they don't necessarily reflect stakeholder impact as well. The second point I wanted to talk about was conducting severe but plausible scenario testing as well. So scenario testing is how entities demonstrate that they can operate within their defined tolerance levels under stress. So a structured approach is really required to ensure that scenario testing is appropriate and also relevant given the size, business mix of your organization. So in a post-implementation world for CPS 230, it's important that scenarios go beyond standard disruptions and reflect a number of different areas. So firstly, scenario testing should reflect multi-failure events. So these scenarios are usually deliberately combined for multiple concurrent failures to reflect how disruptions usually happen in reality. It's important to remember that in reality, major incidences rarely occur in isolation. It's always a combination of different events that occur. So multi-failure scenarios are always a good way to expose any hidden single points of failure that you might have. And also not to be overly optimistic about some of the assumptions that you make. A second area for scenario analysis relates to cyber incidences. So cyber scenarios are usually a key focus given the increasing frequency and severity of attacks and their potential to disrupt your critical operations as well. The third point is just around third-party concentration risks that you should also be aware of as well. So these scenarios focus on an organization's reliance on a limited number of service providers, particularly where there is little or no ability to substitute a service provider. And then the third area of scenario testing really should be around staff unavailability or key person dependency. So these scenarios usually test a regulated entity's resilience to people-related disruptions as well. And you can never underestimate the importance of missing key people. So many critical operations rely on the implicit knowledge of a small number of individuals. So testing these scenarios becomes vital for any regulated entity as well. And it also helps you determine to what extent you are relying on a smaller group of people as well. There's also the end-to-end testing that you should consider as well. So you should cover the entire critical operations and not just individual systems. So end-to-end testing in that context should assess whether critical operations can continue to function through a disruption from start to finish, rather than simply confirming that individual systems or controls are working in isolation as well. The second area around the end-to-end testing really should validate any interdependencies across people, your processes, systems, technology, and third parties as well. So that the testing should really confirm that all those interdependencies supporting a critical operation are still able to work in a sustainable manner under any form of stress as well. Critical operations will rarely rely on one system or team alone, so it's important to make sure that you perform that end-to-end testing as well. In terms of the testing should examine whether those dependencies can remain effective under stressful scenarios or conditions when they're disrupted. So, for example, you should consider whether people understand their roles and responsibilities in the event of a disruption, whether manual processes can be completed as a workaround as well, and also provide assurance that resilience exists across the full operating environment as well, and not just within the isolated components of critical operations. Then the next point around end-to-end testing was to ensure is to include escalation and decision-making processes as well. So it's really important to have clear triggers for escalating particular matters as well. It's not enough to test whether the recovery steps are documented, but you need to also make sure that issues can be identified pretty quickly as well, and then escalated to the right people and managed through the right channels within the organization. When you do the scenario testing in your post-implementation world, make sure your findings are documented. Make sure that you've identified any control weaknesses or gaps, that they're supported with action plans and remediation as well. And we'll talk a bit about that later as well. And that there's integration into the controls testing and assurance program that you have. The third point I just wanted to talk about, Julian, in response to your question, was about the ensuring that there's clear mapping to critical operations and dependencies as well. So having a really robust CPS 230 framework requires you to understand what supports each of the critical operations as well. So in a post-implementation era, should really ensure that critical operations are mapped to key processes and activities, supporting systems and infrastructure as well, data flows, and also any third-party or intra-group service providers as well. The only other thing I would talk about in terms of your mapping as well is basically making sure that the mapping process is dynamic, that continues to reflect the practices across your business as well. Because as we know, critical processes in particular, they change all the time across the business. So I think it's really important to take that into consideration as well. Essentially, the post-implementation for CPS 230 is fundamentally about operationalizing your resilience. And I think that's a really important message to take away from this business continuity planning of our discussion today. So it really needs to talk about what tolerances tolerances should define what must be protected, the scenario testing should really validate whether it can be protected, and then the mapping ensures that organisations understand how it is protected as well.
Thanks, Vito. And I think that really gives us a very clear overview of the post-implementation priorities, when we're thinking about business continuity. And I'm particularly interested in that area around, making sure that we've got the clear mapping. I think that's really essential and perhaps something that people need to do a bit more work on as they go through. Moving on, if we bring that into sort of a practical setting, and given the experience you've been having going out and working with different organisations, where do you see organisations really struggling once they've sort of got their CPS 230 program live?
Yeah, that's a great question,
And do we need to
Julian.
move the slides on? I might just check that as well.
Yeah, that all good. I think we're with the
We're
right
still,
slides.
yep, good.
So in terms of what organisations aren't doing so well, there are probably a few things in the context of business continuity that we're seeing at the moment. So what we are typically seeing is a shift from the design, which would have been done post the implementation of CPS 230, and then that goes into the discipline. And that's where the challenge really is, having discipline around the implementation and embedding effective business continuity. So most organisations, what we've seen, have been really effective in building a framework, but maintaining it in a way that is genuinely operational and decision useful is a lot more difficult, is what we're seeing at the moment. So what we really see is around the difficulties is threefold. So first, it's keeping tolerances relevant as the businesses evolve. So as you would all be aware on today's call, a lot of your tolerances will evolve, and that's just a reaction to a changing business environment as well. Tolerances often set during the initial CPS 230 uplift activities were based on a snapshot of operations, customer expectations, risk appetite at a point in time. However, as I mentioned, businesses aren't static. New products are launched all the time. You've got different delivery channels. Customer volumes will shift across time periods, and technology platforms change as well, along with your reliance on third parties as well. So if tolerances aren't periodically reviewed and recalibrated, they can quickly become outdated and misaligned with your actual operational risk profile. So that's the first point. Then I would say, Julian, the second point that a lot of APRA-regulated entities should consider is making sure that your scenario testing is meaningful rather than just a compliance exercise. So another key struggle for many organisations is moving the scenario testing from a tick box exercise into something that genuinely tests the resilience across your organisation. So there's often a tendency to design scenario testing that is relatively predictable. It's controlled. It's aligned to documented procedures, which can lead to pretty much rehearsed responses rather than realistic outcomes. And only this morning, a really good example where we did a response to we tested a response to a cyber incident, and in many ways, it felt like it was a rehearsed, pre-planned scenario test, and we're able to predict what the outcomes were. So that's a really good example. But in practice, what we find is that real incidents are much more messy, excuse me, ambiguous, and they involve a lot of simultaneous failures as well. So meaningful scenario testing is critical and should introduce a layer of complexity, uncertainty, and pressure as well. The other point I just wanted to make was that the value of that scenario testing lies not in demonstrating that plans exist, but in revealing whether they work in practice and where improvements might be needed as well. So it almost requires some sort of a cultural shift in the way you do business continuity planning and testing, and moving away from passing the test mentality to actively seeking and identifying gaps in your business continuity. And that should be supported by some really strong facilitation, honest feedback as well, and clear follow through on identified issues. And then finally, just in terms of another area that we're sort of seeing as an issue, relates to the use of mapping as well during an incident. And it's not just something that should exist as documentation. So many of the organisations that we've worked with really struggle to ensure that their mapping of critical operations and resources is practical and usable in a real life incident. So while it provides some really detailed documentation and a strong understanding of the critical processes, these outputs really need to be able to be applied in a real case scenario as well, and how you use that. So it should be able to support the restoration of critical operations in a timely manner. So making sure that the mapping isn't buried in volumes of documentation, making sure that you keep your mapping up to date is another critical area that we've seen some organisations not being able to do, but a really important area as well.
Thanks, Vito. And I think you make a really interesting point around the scenario testing, that really what we're thinking about there is creating lessons in managing uncertainty rather than, coming up with a scripted outcome. And to me, I think that's probably one of the biggest things we can get out of that sort of testing phase is, how are we dealing with that uncertainty? What happens when things are thrown at us that we weren't expecting? And so to that end, where do you see the role of senior management, and can you elaborate on the importance of that buy-in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Julian. Senior management and the board play a critical role. Not there, the board in particular, not there just for approving the business continuity plan and other artifacts related to it, but they're there to provide some really strong governance and challenge around the processes as well. So when senior leaders are involved, scenario testing becomes far more realistic. They probably take a more strategic approach to some of the scenarios that should be tested, so they can provide some really good challenge and insight from that perspective. But senior management should really be playing a role to not just test operational capability, but also look at areas such as decision making, escalation, and communication as well. And probably the final point is really around making sure that there's accountability in place for business continuity as well.
Yeah, I think that's essential. Let's move on then. Let's talk about material service providers. What does good practice look like post-implementation in the context of material service providers?
Yeah, look, CPS 230, as we all know, requires organisations to actively manage their service providers as part of their operational risk framework. That's always been a requirement, but it's with CPS 230 and in a post-implementation world, that's now been clarified. So by now, you would have identified your material service providers and the controls you have in place as well to manage some of those material service providers. The management of your service providers is a core pillar for operational existence, and I don't think that is in dispute. Post-implementation, the focus really shifts to ensuring that these arrangements are continuously understood, actively managed by management, and also demonstrably resilient. So that means not just documenting onboarding, but really demonstrating the life cycle of outsourcing as well. So in terms of the first key matter to consider for what a post-implementation environment might look like is that you need to ensure that there's a clear and ongoing identification of prospective material service providers. You've obviously done your initial assessment, but making sure you've got a process in place to revisit that assessment and apply consistent criteria to determine materiality. And when you're considering the materiality, obviously CPS 230 provides a lot of guidance, but also think about confirming the degree of resilience as an example that you might have on that provider for critical operations, ensuring that the substitutability of material service providers, making sure that it's not at ease and the speed of replacement is a consideration that you should take into account, and also the impact on customers' financial positions and your regulatory obligations as well is a critical consideration. Another important part is that each material service provider should be subject to ongoing reassessment. And I think that's a really important consideration. A one-off assessment and then leaving it there isn't enough under a post-implementation world for CPS 230. You can't take a static approach. It needs to be ongoing. So it should be a dynamic approach that's tied to operational risk. The second key matter for material service providers relates to the assessment of making sure the assessment of service providers is detailed and documented. And we've looked at a number of different questionnaires that organisations have used in order to perform that ongoing assessment of their material service providers. And I'll make a few points of what better practice would look like in terms of what we see in terms of that assessment. So the first thing being, the assessments of service providers will always cover their corporate governance and risk management practices. So looking at whether that material service provider has a strong corporate governance structure with a governing body supported with audit committees, risk committees, to really ensure that there's strong governance and risk management as well. The second point is whether they receive assurance across their own processes and systems and controls. So looking at your material service provider, are they going out getting a GS 007 report or a ASAE 3150 report that looks at some of the internal controls that they have? Are they sharing that information with you as a customer? Is a really important consideration as well. And the next point there is, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but what kind of work are you doing around some of the material that they're providing around assurance as well? As part of your assessment, you should look at their business continuity and disaster recovery planning as well. I think it's important for our audience today to get comfort of that across their service providers and also any fourth parties that might be involved as well. As part of your assessment, are you doing a review of their information security protocols to prevent any leakage or unauthorized access to information as well? And then finally, you would want to also be doing or looking at their processes for compliance with modern slavery laws, privacy obligations, and any other requirements that might be appropriate as well. So that ongoing assessment is important. It's important you document it, you consider some of those areas that I've just discussed, which is absolutely critical as well. And then a final component of what strong post-implementation looks like for CPS 230 is the monitoring and assurance that you're doing over your service providers as well. It's a really important consideration. As I sort of mentioned, better ongoing monitoring and supervision will include assessment against KPIs that might be in service level agreements, monitoring incidences, breaches, near misses, and tracking those trends as well across time is critical. So, as I mentioned before, you might receive periodic control assurance. These reports should be received and reviewed by organisations as a way of demonstrating oversight of service providers as well. The one thing that we do see is a lot of APRA-regulated entities don't go to the full extent when chasing up on any exceptions that might be raised in a report as well. So I think one piece of advice or a bit of a tip is make sure if there are any exceptions in those reports that you do receive from your material service providers, you follow those up and you get absolute comfort and also understand how they relate to the services that might be provided to yourself as well. The other thing you might want to consider around effective monitoring and assurance is to make sure that you can participate in some of the scenario testing or resilience exercises that your service provider undertakes as well. So really talk to your material service providers about the type of scenario testing that they do and see where, if possible, you can influence some of that scenario testing as well. And then finally, importantly, on-site reviews and deep dives. A lot since the implementation of CPS 230, what we're seeing a lot more of is organisations doing their own on-site reviews. Recently, I was involved with one with a superannuation entity, and they had their own risk team go into the service provider and do a bit of a risk review to get comfort as well. So that probably gives you a bit of an indication, Julian, of some of the things that we're seeing in the context of managing material service providers following the implementation of CPS 230.
Thanks, Vito. And look, some of that sounds like a fair amount of work, right? And extending out to things like on-site reviews and really working with those material service providers suggests a very symbiotic relationship, and it's got to be managed effectively so that people understand why things are being done and are open to collaborating, I guess. Given that we've got a real range of different clients on the call today, what's the one thing that you'd suggest in the context of material service providers, that they could action?
Yeah, look, I'd probably leave the audience with, the one thing I would talk about is don't become over-reliant on periodic reporting such as monthly SLA reports or KPI reports without deeper assurance of whether the provider is actually performing under the contract as well. So I think it's not falling into that trap of getting your monthly statements from the service provider, reviewing them, filing them. It's really about sitting it down, challenging those reports that they might provide, where there's opportunity for to dig deeper, to truly understand whether the material service provider can continue to provide services even when they might need to perform under stress as well. So I think that's a really important consideration.
Thanks, Vito. And we've spoken about the importance of, leadership buy-in here. When we think about material service providers, what are the sort of key questions that management should be asking about those providers?
Yeah, so recently I had a bit of a situation where there was a cybersecurity attack on a fourth party, and this had a significant implication on the client's operations. So during the episode, management asked some really important questions, such as did we have visibility over their control environment? To what extent did we have that visibility over the control environment? And also what contractual and operational levers did they have over the service provider? So although those were some really good questions to ask, it's also really important that those questions are asked at the outset and not when you're going through a scenario like that. So I think that's a really important consideration as well.
Thanks, Vito. And I suspect this is going to be a learning environment too, as we continue to have issues pop up, cases, attacks, things like that. There's going to be more things that we can learn from those cases. Okay, so let's turn to controls and testing. How should organizations evolve post-implementation?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. I think this is where one particular area where I think a lot of organisations have some work to do and some strengthening. So the first piece of advice I always give in relation to CPS 230, especially in this post-implementation world, is to ensure that you've got a controls testing plan in place that's subject to the oversight of the relevant governing body and or the board committee, such as a risk and audit committee as well. Unfortunately, what I'm sort of seeing post 230 is that many organisations still don't perform any form of controls testing, whether that be at first line or second line, and that'll really depend on the size and structure of the organisation as well. So I think having that risk-based controls testing is really important as well. In terms of the controls testing, should really be prioritized on risk as well, rather than applied on a uniform sort of basis across all controls. You've got to have a really clear sense of which controls are critical to maintaining your management of operational risk as well. So I think that's a really important consideration. You might do that. There should really be alignment to your operational risk profile as well. And I think that, in testing which controls that you need to test, firstly and more frequently, you should take into consideration a range of different areas. So, for example, your critical operations, what controls are essential to maintaining your critical operations, and they're probably some of the controls that you test on a more frequent and regular basis as well. Looking at high risk processes and systems within your operational risk framework, and again, giving those some priority compared to other controls as well. Material service providers, I think that's an area that you might want to look at testing more frequently. I think that's a really important consideration, given the role that material service providers play for many of the regulated entities as well. And also where you've done testing previously and you know that there are some control weaknesses in particular areas, again, you want to do some more extra testing in those areas to make sure that any appropriate uplift has been effective as well. You might also take a tiered approach to your testing where key controls are subject to more rigorous testing, and your non-key controls experience more of a light touch sort of test as well. So the next point there is just around making sure that you have some triggers in place for controls testing as well. What I do see, especially in this post 230 world, is that there will be some sort of controls testing, but thinking about what should trigger some controls testing as well. And there are a number of triggers that you should consider. So first, emerging risks. So for example, with cyber threats, controls testing should be responsive to new and evolving threats such as cyber security, particularly those that could disrupt your critical operations. Second, you might want to look at incident and near miss trends as well. So controls testing should be informed by what is actually going wrong as well within your organization. And then use data to guide where testing should be performed. So I think that the use of data, and you've got so much of it, whether it's around incidences, whether it's around breaches, that data should be used to help, should be used as a trigger for controls testing as well. And then look at your scenario testing outcomes as well. What is your scenario testing telling you about your control environment? And that should also provide some forward-looking insights into potential control failures that are under stress. And that should then directly inform some of the controls testing that is in place as well. And then finally, any changes in your business operations or your technology as well. So any material changes to how you operate might trigger a reassessment of your controls testing plan. So controls testing plans should also be updated after the implementation of any new systems that you put in place or any platforms as well. So that's probably a really important consideration as well. The other interesting bit is just around implementing appropriate processes and systems for controls remediation. So I think this is a particular area where I don't see being too strong of an area, and I think that is something that we struggle with a lot of organisations, having the appropriate processes and systems in place for controls remediation. And this is a real big focus area in CPS 230. There's a couple of paragraphs that explain that APRA entities must remediate material weaknesses in its operational risk management as well, including control gaps. And with the remediation, you need to be able to demonstrate clear accountabilities and assurance and address the root causes of the weaknesses as well. And I think, Julian, a really important point there is that having that data should help you identify what those root causes are as well. So that's a really important area, having a framework for controls remediation, clear accountabilities, being able to have a demonstrable framework for controls remediation. It's something we don't see a lot of with a lot of the regulated entities that we've done work with previously. So that is a real strong area. And you see it in a lot of the speeches that come out of APRA as well. So it's a really important consideration, making sure that there is a robust process for controls remediation.
Thanks, Vito. I think we've sort of covered that whole area around controls testing, but other than the sort of remediation piece, are there any other areas that you think need to be improved? Is there other ways that we should be thinking about controls testing?
Yeah, look, thanks, Julian. I think it's a really good point. And I think in terms of that, I'd really reinforce that for effective controls testing under CPS 230, you should be able to test three critical questions or explore three critical questions. The first one is, are we testing the right controls? So do we have a risk-based approach? And do we have triggers in place to make sure that we're testing the right controls? The second point I would probably make is, are we testing what matters most? And that's really looking at how does your testing relate back to your critical operations. So there needs to be that focus on critical operations. The next point relates to the third question is, do the controls actually work when needed? So being able to demonstrate their effectiveness when you're under stress is a really important consideration as well. So when it's done well, controls testing becomes more of a core measure for validating operational resilience rather than a compliance exercise.
Yeah, thanks, Vito. I think that's really practical. So look, I'm conscious that we're coming towards our hour, and that's great. Are there any other insights you'd like to share about CPS 230 more broadly?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a couple of critical insights, and the first one is just around the post-implementation review. So a lot of the organisations that we've been working with are currently completing CPS 230 post-implementation reviews. A lot of these, like with all different regulatory change, full compliance is unusual to achieve immediately. But after a year or 18 months, it's a good time to do a post-implementation review. So if there is any non-compliance, you're sort of picking up on that sooner rather than later. It might help you identify where there might be gaps in your operational risk management framework. but also don't forget to establish a remediation plan. And that goes to my earlier point about really making sure you've got structure around remediation where you've identified gaps as well. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of, and this is directly linked to the guidance provided in CPS 230, but many organisations are coming up to their CPS 220 triennial comprehensive review, and a lot of these CPS 230 reviews are being completed on the back of a CPS 220 triennial review as well. So it's a nice way to sort of do that review as well. The second point is just consider some of the APRA focus areas for 2025 and 2026 as well. So when APRA released its 25-26 corporate plan and for beyond, they did say they would continue to engage with entities to ensure that they're meeting their obligations under CPS 230. So sometimes doing a quick sort of snapshot review of your approach to CPS 230 before a regulator comes in is a really effective way of getting at least some comfort around the approach that you've adopted to CPS 230 as well. Usually they'll focus on the larger entities before they then go and target some of the smaller entities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Vito. And I think that's really important, right? We can see what's going on. We can see where the regulator's focusing their attention, so that can help us triage into the areas that we need to focus on. And obviously this is a continually moving feast too. Now we're sort of reviewing all your material service providers, some of those contracts that may have been existing prior to the to CPS 230 coming in, now starting to be caught. So there's a lot of change that will continue to go through these programs. As we conclude today's session, are there any sort of key takeaways that you think our audience really needs to be aware of?
Yeah, look, thanks, Julian. I think there's probably three key points I wanted to just re-emphasize after today's discussion. I think the first one is just around recognizing that operational risk frameworks are dynamic and they must be dynamic. They've got to evolve in line with the organization's risk profile, the operating environment, and also the external threats as well. So that means, importantly, update essential to ensuring that the operational risk framework maintains its relevance and also its effectiveness as well. You should have established and structured review cycles. They should be complemented by trigger-based updates as well, following reviews of incidences, near misses, any regulatory developments and material changes to your business as well. Importantly, that should also be supported by your ongoing testing, ensuring that your operational risk policies, procedures, and controls are not only capable of responding to a disruption as intended, but that they also react to a dynamic environment in which you operate. Secondly, I think there must be some focus on real-world effectiveness. A lot of the time, these things can be really theoretical, but they need to operate in a real-world scenario. And CPS 230 places a strong emphasis on demonstrating that controls and resilience arrangements work in practice and not just in theory. So you need to move beyond that design assessment and now actively test how your controls perform under stress as well. So that's a really important consideration. And the key question is whether you can continue to deliver critical operations during significant disruptions as well, rather than whether the documentation stands strong as well. And then finally, integration. Integration is critical. So making sure that your operational resilience under CPS 230 really does depend on the integration of business continuity, material service provider management, and controls testing into a single cohesive system. You don't want all these different areas to operate in silos. They need to be able to operate in harmony. And I think that's a really important consideration as well, having that interconnectedness and mutually reinforcing each other as well. So that's probably the final point I wanted to make today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vito. And I really appreciate all your insights today. It's I think, really important for people to have a practical understanding and get those real life examples of where things are going right, where things are going wrong, and so on. Also, a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. I don't know if there are any questions. We've got one here from Damien around with material service providers. What experiences have you had with vendors unwilling to provide information and visibility required? Have you come across that, Vito?
Yeah, look, it's a frequent question that we do receive and we do see. But look, with a lot of the service providers that we're seeing now, they're recognizing that it's important for their business to support their clients, because a lot of them service more than just one APRA regulated entity, and they've got a really strong awareness of what the obligations are now. Whether it's a superannuation sector, private health insurance, service providers, there has been a greater awareness. But there have been cases where service providers have been reluctant to make the necessary changes to their own processes and systems. And what we've seen in those particular cases, and this is going to sound pretty tough, Julian, but a lot of those companies, a lot of those APRA regulated entities have moved on.
Yeah.
They've looked for new service providers who are more familiar with the APRA requirements, and they've actually taken the approach to move on to other service providers as well. That can cause a lot of work, obviously, for management, but what they're finding is they're getting better outcomes from service providers who are willing to meet the requirements from CPS 230.
Yeah, thanks, Vito. I mean, it sounds like a little bit of pain to begin with, but a much better relationship going forward, where you've got service providers who actually understand the pressure you're under from the regulators. Great question. Thanks, Damien. Another one here. Any particular tips for foreign ADIs regarding CPS 230?
Yeah, look, I think with foreign ADIs, we've done a bit of work with a foreign bank branch. Look, I think to some extent some they should be applying a pretty consistent approach with non-foreign ADIs. There are some differences that they can take advantage of, but taking a consistent approach, and there you do have reliance on the services that could be provided from parent company overseas as well, but really making sure that you can demonstrate how you continue to meet CPS 230. It continues to be critical in that sense. I think it's also important to recognize, to have good, strong documentation where you might be, where you believe you might not to meet a full requirement. Document your logic. If there are any gaps, documenting the rationale for that as well, I think is a really important step as well. But really what we're seeing with a lot of the organizations is that they're taking a pretty much consistent approach as if they weren't a foreign entity or branch.
Great. Thanks, Vito. We've got one more. What approach with APRA's non-traditional service providers? What?
In terms of non-traditional service providers, is there any clarification around non-traditional service providers? Just trying to look at so I'm assuming it's non-traditional. Yeah, so I'm assuming they're service providers who might not provide your consistent type of services, such as whether it's IT, internal audit. Look, I think you should take a consistent approach, whether they're traditional or non-traditional service providers. CPS 230 doesn't discriminate between your more traditional or non-traditional service providers, so you should really take a consistent approach.
Great, thanks, Vito. And maybe we'll get in touch later and get a bit more detail on that question and answer it directly. Vito, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really fantastic to talk through this with you. For those people out there who are interested in our consulting services, we work across a range of different areas in the governance, risk and compliance space. So by all means, reach out to us contact us at GRC Solutions. We've also been working with a number of organisations on building training for their staff around business continuity. And obviously that needs to be tailored to your individual business continuity plan. But very, very happy to have a chat to you about that sort of stuff as well. We will be sending you out some more information and looking forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Many thanks, and thank you, Vito.
Thanks, Julian, and thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you got something out of it. And as Julian said, we're more than happy to have a conversation and support you with any of the challenges you come across in the post-implementation world.
Great. Thanks, Vito.